This Soviet World. Chapter 13. The Democratization of Art. Quote, "Heroic people call into being heroic artists." From an editorial in Soviet Literary Critic. If science is the instrument of man's dominance over nature, art is the means of his self-expression. Tens of millions of people from Earth's most backward races have awakened in the Soviet Union from long slumber. They are seeking self-expression. They themselves write, sing, and paint. They push up from their ranks novelists, poets, and dramatists. They love these poets and dramatists. They criticize them and make serious demands from them. Soviet art is not private property. It is the wealth of the nation, and the nation is jealous and proud of its wealth. When the first All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers met in Moscow in August 1934, thousands of letters poured in from all corners of the Union, congratulating, greeting, giving practical suggestions and advice. Workers, collective farmers, students, young pioneers, scientists, engineers, and artists thus expressed their interest in the Congress. In Moscow alone, more than 200 factory conferences were held between readers and authors. Delegations representing millions of readers came to speak at the Congress. Each day after the meetings, authors found throngs of workers who had been unable to enter the crowded hall waiting outside to hail their favorite writers with applause. Throughout the country, millions of people concentrated their attention on questions of aesthetics, the function of poetry, the form of literature best suited to the present age. Subjects reported in detail in the press. Literary work in the land of the Soviets is becoming the affair of all the toilers. There are no bounds to the desire for every variety of culture. Soviet Russia, in its first 15 years, published 5 billion books, as contrasted with 2 billion in the last 30 years of Tsardom. The number keeps growing. At the end of the first 5-year plan, book production in the USSR was greater than that of England, Germany, and France together. Especially amazing is the growth of literature among the national minorities, whose self-expression was suppressed under Tsardom. Every year since 1929 has seen the publication of more books in the Ukrainian language than were published in the whole 118 years before the revolution. One publishing house alone, the Moscow International Book House, publishes books in 85 languages, some of which had formerly no alphabet. Novels, textbooks, folk tales, technical works, translations of classics, short stories, and dictionaries. The Soviet world feels itself the heir of the ages. Anniversaries of poets, scientists, and artists of all countries are widely celebrated. The ancient Persian poet Firdausi, the English Shakespeare, the German Goethe, the famous French writers, are honored by mass meetings and columns in the press. The best works of Flaubert, Mérimée, Maupassant, Victor Hugo, Mark Twain, and Jack London appear by the hundreds of thousands of copies, and disappear almost as quickly from the shelves of bookstores, which never expect to retain volumes more than a few weeks. Russian classics are even more popular. Lermontov, Nekrasov, Korolenko, Gogol, Turgenev, Chekhov appear in editions of 70 to 100,000. The favorite poet Pushkin has been issued for several years in repeated editions of 200,000 copies, and his collected works in 6 volumes now face a subscription demand of 300,000 copies, exclusive of sales to the shops. Tolstoy is the most popular of all. 11.5 million copies of his works have been sold since the revolution. The Soviet reader demands not only the art of the past, but the art of today. The most popular novels are those like Sholokov's Quiet Dawn and Soil Upturned, which paint on a wide canvas the personalities, difficulties, struggles, and victories of the present. Quote, no artist of the past had such material at his disposal as is given by the earth-shaking events occurring in the USSR in the last 18 years, said the Soviet writer Panfarov, speaking at a Paris Congress. Quote, the working class built a dam on the surging Dnieper and made its unruly waters serve man. It transformed the misty Urals into an industrial center, mastered the wild and distant Kuzbas. In remaking the country, the working class at the same time remade itself. The outcast dweller of the mountains, the illiterate solitary Yakut, the northern Nensi, the wild Bashkir, the Mordvin with his trachoma, the persecuted Kalmyk. Tens of millions of peoples in scores of scattered nationalities went into the furnace of civil war and are energetically rebuilding the country, conquering the strongholds of culture, bringing new life to the whole world. Socialist realism was the inevitable phenomenon of the proletarian era, active, cheerful, bold, and daring, like the era of the proletarian revolution itself. End quote. These tens of millions of people are not only the subjects for art, they are also the artists, readers, and audience. They show a wide interest in all forms of artistic expression. Theaters are constantly crowded. Art museums are packed with visitors. Popular exhibitions sometimes have lines before the museum entrances, waiting until there is room to go in. Nor are the factory workers and collective farmers at all backward in expressing their opinion on the products of brush and pen. Are they not all also writers, artists, musicians, and actors, if and when the mood seizes them? They are not only consumers of art, millions of them are amateur producers of it. More than 100,000, quote, circles for self-expression have grown up in the past 2 years in the USSR. The drama circles alone have 1.2 million members, while the total number in the singing, music, dancing, and graphic art circles exceeds 5 million. Writers, cartoonists, and photographers for the local press or wall newspapers are probably as many more. A chief characteristic of the new type of person now emerging in the Soviet Union is his dynamic energy and self-expression, usually in some collective form. The first and most direct self-expression of large numbers takes the form of participation in the press. They write their opinions about corrupt officials or inefficient farm management for the hand-lettered sheet posted on the factory wall or a village tree trunk. More important communications they send, often with several signatures, to the great Metropolitan Pravda or Zvezdia with their 1.5 million subscribers. 2 million letters a year pour into the office of the Peasants' Gazette in Moscow, reflecting the life and problems of the farm. Only part of them can be published, but all of them are answered, filed, and carefully studied as material for novels, for history, and for the lawmaking of the state. In a northern township 50 miles from the railroad, where before the revolution only 6 people subscribed to any newspaper at all, I visited a congress of some 200 rural press correspondents preparing for a sewing campaign. These were only part of the energetic writers of this township. Its collective farms had 470 field brigades, every one of which during the sewing campaign posted up a wall newspaper. One picturesque 17-year-old boy in a vivid shirt of old rose sateen under a black jacket proudly reported the overthrow of the corrupt management of his collective farm by his articles and editorials. We got out 9 numbers, he explained to the meeting. Then we stopped for want of paper. But we had already aroused the farmers, and the general meeting removed the president and 2 members of the management. End quote. 9 single sheets of crude newsprint, stuck in successive weeks on a tree, protected from the rain by an overhanging board, had deposed the management of a farm, shamed idlers, carried the sowing through to success, finished the hoeing, and brought the brigade on record time to the haying season. The number of these collective farm wall newspapers throughout the country is estimated by the Peasants' Gazette as 500,000, with at least 10 village correspondents for each. There are more than 3,000 factory newspapers. These range from weeklies of a few hundred copies to dailies with a circulation of 20,000 and more in the larger plants. These newspapers are both an organizing center for factory and farm life, and a training school for young writers. With such a writing and reading public, it is not surprising that there are more than 11,000 printed newspapers in the Soviet Union, with a circulation of more than 36 million copies, 13 times as great as before the revolution. An ever-growing stream of writers enters literature through the gateway of the factory and farm newspapers, which make modest but insistent demands on the humblest worker able to use a pen. Literary groups arise in centers like the Urals and the Donets Basin, or around some tractor station which serves the nearby villages. Many of the Donbass group of writers embarked on their literary careers when through with their day's work of furnishing coal. Their magazine, Literary Donbass, has produced a noteworthy crop of stories and poems, widely popular among miners. The Literary Society of Collective Farmers at the Machine Tractor Station in Voronovo village had as members 2 stablemen, a blacksmith, a reaper, a tractor driver, a bookkeeper, a warehouseman, 4 day nursery attendants, 3 teachers, 2 presidents of collective farms, 1 village president, 3 editors of field newspapers, and 16 farm women. In 1 year, the members published through their own print shop 2 books of verses, the play Miscalculated, and 2 books of character sketches, Bolsheviks of the Politodels. They announced for the following year a play, according to merit, a novel, quiet subversion, The Diary of a Tractor Driver, and The History of the Machine Tractor Station. It is difficult to conceive of the wide extent of amateur art activities of all kinds. Thousands of short-line popular stanzas known as chastinski appear in the most distant parts of the Soviet Union, celebrating the freedom of woman, the heroism of tractor drivers, the growing prosperity of collective life. They vary in merit from mere doggerel, giving rhymed technical guidance for reapers and cattle herders, to verse of real beauty. The Donetsk coal region alone reports more than 800 brass bands, 300 orchestras, 250 choristers, thousands of dramatic circles, and even 42 ballet schools. Some of the Soviet dancers who attracted attention at a recent London dance festival came from these self-expression groups. Amateur circles in drawing and painting also exist all over the country, and give local exhibitions which often unearth talent. A constant interchange of ideas and personnel goes on between professional and non-professional groups. The Soviet press takes active part in establishing these connections. The newspaper Culture and Sport publishes reproductions of the best art from famous galleries. It encourages would-be artists to correspond and send in their work to be judged by well-known artists. Those who show talent are sent to art schools. The magazine Collective Farm Theater every month issues 8 or 10 special supplements containing plans of caravan theaters, rural pageants and festivals, choral programs, texts of one-act plays. It connects the self-expression groups with the nearest professional theater, which can help them in their technique. There are today 100 rural theaters of professional standing. One among many movements which swept the farms in the summer of 1935 was a campaign to discover musical talent among children. Hundreds of local musical festivals were held, to many of which professors from the Moscow Conservatory came by airplane to act as judges. As a result, 715 of the most talented children are being sent to special musical schools. The 25 best ones were brought to a specially created branch in the Moscow Conservatory of Music. Not only in music, but in poetry, drama, and dancing, nationwide, quote, Olympiads were held in the summer of 1935. In Leningrad, for instance, juries of artists visited the factories to select 1,100 contestants for the district Olympiad from 15,000 amateur musicians, singers, dancers, acrobats, orators, accordion players, and even jugglers. On a collective farm in Smolensk, an illiterate peasant woman of 64 years wrote a play, dictating it to a younger woman. The young folks of the farm produced it at the Olympiad in Smolensk. Besides the Olympiads, many, quote, culture expeditions of both scholars and composers penetrate the wilderness where live Kyrgyz, Buryat Mongols, Tajiks, Uzbeks, to seek and preserve the music and poems which shed light on early culture. A symphony orchestra recently organized made its first tour, playing old Cossack melodies in modern style, across what not so long ago was the steppe of half-savage nomads. Collective farms sent delegations hundreds of miles to insist that the orchestra visit them. Out of this artistic ferment in the lives of millions arises the vigor of Soviet art, which feels itself called upon to find adequate expression for the awakening genius of the people. Soviet writers today, if they would be popular, must not confine themselves to delving in the depths of a single human soul. They must depict the vast variety of changing social relations. They spend much time in deepening their contacts with intimate details of factory or a farm. Sholokhov, for instance, makes his permanent residence in the village whose changing life is the subject of a whole series of novels. Nor is the artist's human material passive. The human material talks back. The Vakhtangov Theater invites the audience to discuss plays between the scenes and at the end with the actors. Witty and fruitful discussions occur. Meetings between writers and readers have become a popular feature of factory life. Authors like Sholokhov and Tretyakov have long adopted the custom of reading drafts of semi-finished manuscripts to audiences of workers and farmers. Frequently, a worker is able to give sound advice on the handling of an industrial character. Our reader, while a friend, is also a very severe critic, says the Soviet writer Vsevolod Ivanov. Intercourse with him is the best and most precious school. Soviet readers demand simplicity and vividness of writing. They are not interested in complex analysis of burdened souls. Their whole life faces outward. Their interest is in people who do things, who change the relations of society. In the first decade after the revolution, a typical theme in literature and drama was the hero who died in the moment of victory, while the collective achievement marched on. The hero might be a Chapayev shot down before his victorious comrades appear on the scene, or a village organizer killed by a kulak and drawn to his grave in triumphal procession by the newly arrived tractor with which his labor had secured. The victory was collective, attained through the sacrifice of the heroic individual. Thus was the natural expression of the period of revolution and civil war. New themes begin to dominate Soviet literature and drama of recent years. The hero no longer dies. He struggles, achieves, learns, and is himself made over, not by introspection, but by the clash of action. He is the optimist, builder type, creating a glorious and happy future. What the people demand of writers, they demand also of the graphic arts. An art that is inspired by, and in turn inspires, the great moods of the day. The workers of Stalingrad sent a famous open letter to the artists. Don't give us colored photographs, we are tired of them. We expect from you an art that is stirring and inspiring. End quote. If the responsive demand of a great new public is a constant stimulus to Soviet artists, a second stimulus is found in cooperation with members of their craft. Writers, actors, painters, all have their organizations. They maintain clubhouses for social contacts, discussions, and exhibitions. They have country retreats to which members withdraw for rest and creative work. They assist beginners with loans and subsidies. They foster high standards. They assist members in the sale of their work. The Writers' Organization issues literary journals, organizes courses, consultations, and criticisms for new writers, and runs a literary university for workers. The Actors Club holds special midnight performances where its members meet famous visiting artists and see the season's best in music, dance, and drama. 4,000 artists belong to a cooperative which not only handles exhibitions all over the country, but also owns numerous factories producing artists' supplies, workshops for stone cutting, metal casting, and frame making, and studios for lithography and engraving. This cooperative has a yearly turnover of 42 million rubles. It accepts on behalf of its members orders from city soviets, large industries, and workers' clubs, which wish decorations and paintings. Some of these orders run over the million-ruble mark. When the 10-year reconstruction plan of Moscow creates a demand for architecture, sculpture, landscaping, and monumental art, the artists' organizations arrange discussions and excursions of sculptors and architects, and initiate experimental fresco work on a large scale. Instead of being an isolated craftsman, the Soviet artist is part of a rich and influential organization, which connects him with the government planning departments and the organized life of the country. From this close association of artists with their fellow craftsmen and with their public has arisen a method of collective production which is becoming increasingly popular. It extends to the collective writing of books by a score of writers and even by whole factories. 30 professional writers combined to produce Bellamore, the famous tale of the building of the Baltic White Sea Canal. Quote, "We tried to tell how a canal was built in a far, cold, and rocky place, and how the Czechists made new men out of prisoners," said Vsevolod Ivanov. Quote, "We were authors entirely different in taste and in age, but we all tried to make that book united, wide-horizoned, and mighty. That book is dear to me even today. In writing it, I learned that we writers are not really such individualists as we like to call ourselves." End quote. The events of the High Mountain, which told the history of an iron mine in the Urals, was written by more than 100 miners. The miners consulted, wrote, and improved it in common, as together they created and improved their mine. The book is a great political and artistic document, energetic, fresh, and vital. The history of the Civil War, the history of factories, and now projected history of the Russian village contain whole series of books, each of which compiles the experiences of hundreds or even thousands of people. The characters are not described by others, they describe themselves, each seeking in consultation with the others a significant artistic form. The meeting of 200 village correspondents which I attended decided to issue a book giving artistic form to the history of the township. They selected the best writers from each of the 25 villages to work with 2 professional authors who had come from Moscow. Each local writer chose, with the help of his village, some vivid and significant episode or character whose story illumined the changes made by the revolution. One contrasted the intimate family relations in his father's household with those in his own Soviet home. Another described the people who had successfully looked out of the windows of a certain ancient building, once a school for the daughters of the nobility, and now for the central club of a collective farm. The result was a book which was lacking in style and finish, but vivid and unforgettable with actual life. It was not yet art, but it made part of the rich soil out of which great art may well grow in the next few decades. Great art movements in the past have followed periods of economic expansion, which gave stimulus to new creative life. Quote, "We are already in the great epoch. Artistic values of permanent worth are already appearing, but not yet the great masterpieces. Where else in the world are there even high artistic values?" said a Soviet writer to me. In literature, Ostrovsky's How Steel is Welded, Sholokov's Quiet Dawn. In motion pictures, Potemkin, Chapayev, The Youth of Maxim, are among the many lasting contributions which the Soviets have already made to art. The Moscow subway is one of the first significant expressions of the epoch in architecture. As forums and temples express the spirit of ancient Rome, cathedrals and castles the Middle Ages, and skyscrapers the power of centralized finance, so this beautiful subway expresses the rhythm of millions of workers in efficient motion. The Lenin Library in Moscow and the House of State Industry in Kharkov, and some of the new factories, children's centers, and sanatoriums also foreshadow the new architecture. Are Soviet artists, quote, in uniform? Only insofar as they lack intelligence to respond to their social environment and the will to fight their way through to expression. Artists whose souls were formed by an old world felt the coming of the new age as a thwarting of impulses. They had to find their way about among new publishers and new officials, who were trying more or less intelligently to protect the new order. Often, groups of rising artists hogged the revolution and organized to lord it over their fellows. Thus, the RAPP, Association of Revolutionary Writers, succeeded in imposing its narrow standards for a considerable period, till other authors learned the new environment and smashed the RAPP. The social environment also changes. When that excellent play, Days of the Turbines, featured a Tsarist officer as hero before post-war audiences where budding capitalists cheered him, young communist organizations fresh from fighting those officers protested wrathfully and had the play suppressed. When NEP men followed the Civil War into the past, the play revived to more tolerant audiences. All authors everywhere adjust themselves to editors, publishers, and readers. These are necessary media, no less than words or paint. Not even in America could, quote, proletarian authors come into being until there were new readers who pushed them up. Soviet society also presses in various ways on artists. We authors deal with publishers who are worried by their paper quota. Their criterion is importance rather than profit, since any half-good book is sure to sell. They rely in part on, quote, political editors, officials of the Commissariat of Education, whose function is to give advice on the demands of the educational field and the political significance of the work. My own conversations with these political editors, they dislike the name censors, are singularly like those with published readers in America. They make suggestions, some extremely valuable, some moderately useful, and some of which I protest. They themselves yield to reason and prefer authors who know what they do. Only crude authors take them as enemies. Through mutual discussion, the product is improved. If differences lie too deep, one seeks another publisher. In the Soviet Union, there's also the wider appeal. No one autocrat censors everything. Political editors more and more become highly educated specialists. Important plays are usually previewed by selected audiences of leading critics and persons familiar with their theme, both children and educators, previewing a drama or motion picture destined for children. Only on military matters and material likely to injure the Soviets' international relations is the censor absolute, and these matters are hardly the realm of art. Footnote. The most striking recent example was the suppression of information during the difficult year of 1932, a suppression which turned several American journalists permanently against the Soviets. The Soviets believed with some reason that derailed knowledge of their difficulties would provoke the threatened Japanese invasion. End footnote. If art survived the censoring by the whims of princelings in the feudal ages, and by the profit motives of American publishers, why should it not survive the decisions of educational authorities and experienced critics who estimate its importance for a socialist society? To the artist now growing up in a Soviet environment, art is the natural expression of the collective life of millions, given significant form by his own special talent or genius. Such an artist feels no repression in this new environment. He feels its great creative urge. Millions of rural journalists, thousands of dramatic clubs, tens of thousands of farm and factory orchestras furnish an alert and appreciative public. The leisure made possible by the social ownership of great modern machines is already widely used in the Soviet Union for pursuits of science and art. The barriers thus begin to wear thin between manual and mental labor. The same person does both. Genius, wherever it arises, finds ready access to widening expression. From such a soil, watered by the artistic strivings of millions, great art must grow. More than great art, a people to whom art becomes man's natural self-expression, which no longer flames and dies. End section.